Thrill is gone, thrill is gone away. Thrill is gone, baby. Thrill is gone away. You know you done me wrong, baby, and you'll be sorry one day. B.B. King is cool, right? He's got soul. When we say stuff like this, we know these are American ideas, like they didn't come from Europe. But do we understand that they're West African? West African people who came to this country as slaves brought incredible ideas about art and consciousness that shaped American culture. But in grade school, you know, we hear that the Dutch named New York and that the French influenced our ideas about individual liberty. But, you know, some 60,000 West African captives arrived in the New World per year during the transatlantic slave trade, and they actually outnumbered European migrants by nearly 5 to 1. But we hear very little about their influence. And in fact, when I was writing for blues magazines, sometimes I was told, you know, blues fans really don't want to hear that Africa stuff. And that really bugged me from the Wolof word bugal, which means to annoy. The Wolof in the 1600s had a wealthy, fabulous empire in western Senegal. And in 1670, their Fulani neighbors invaded. And the Fulani sold Wolof prisoners to British slave traders who shipped them to South Carolina plantations. There, Wolof slaves were highly prized for their blacksmithing, leatherwork, and butchery skills. And Wolof words like banana, yam, and chigger passed into American English. We say, I dig that, from the Wolof word dega, which means to appreciate. We say that cat can really sing from the Wolof cat, K-A-T-T, which means an accomplished singer. We are hip and have hippies and hipsters because of the Wolof adjective hippie, which means someone who's open-eyed and aware. Some slaves came from Kimbundu in the Angola region, and they brought an instrument with them called the mabanza that became our banjo. And this was a black instrument until in the 1800s, minstrel shows used it in their mocking representations of black people. And this prompted black musicians to abandon the banjo, leaving it for southern whites to use in country and bluegrass music. By the 1700s, the slave trade had gotten to the Bakongo region. We got words like jiffy from their word shippy, which means in a second. We got boo-boo from their mabubu. And as the slave trade reached Yoruba land, which today encompasses Nigeria, Benin, and Togo, we picked up a lot of powerful influences. In Yoruba culture, the ability to connect with one's inner divinity and express that in art and music is called itutu, which means coolness. And that characteristic is displayed by generosity, which is considered the finest quality that a person can exhibit. So that's why we say if someone's nice to us that they're cool. That's why we say B.B. King's got soul, and we admire Southern hospitality. William Ferris experienced this firsthand when he was a young white scholar roaming around the Mississippi Delta in the early 1960s looking for blues musicians. As he wrote in Blues from the Delta, black families constantly extended their hospitality to me, offering to house and feed me for as long as I was in their neighborhood. A blues musician said to him, you know, next time you come by my house, if I'm not there, just walk in. If I eat a piece of bread, you eat too. That's the power of cool. So I actually didn't know any of this when I fell in love with the blues at age 16. I was raised in a white Milwaukee suburb, and I had a crush on this slightly older guy who was in a rock band. And he was booking a club downtown and snuck me in there one summer night to see Coco Taylor and Sun Seals. And I kind of flipped out. Like, I'd never heard the blues, I'd never danced, but I flew out of my seat onto the dance floor and just kind of went nuts. And on the dance floor, I met Mike, a hyperactive blues fanatic from the South Side who looked like a freckled teenage Paul McCartney. And a couple weeks later, we drove to this cornfield in the middle of nowhere, and there on this plywood stage was B.B. King with his guitar Lucille resting on his belly on a sweltering August afternoon. The generator kept cutting off King in mid-solo. And I can personally attest that that's one of the best excuses for a guitar player to pitch a fit. But King was cool. He would just shrug and smile at Lucille and just wait until they got the power fixed. Once they did, there was no stopping King and his band. They were in full dinner jackets in the heat, and they just rocked. And a crowd of people were kicking up dust, dancing in front of the stage. And Mike and I looked around and realized we were probably looked like we were the only white people. But we just really still couldn't stop ourselves from dancing, so we sort of started like our little shy thing, and we're getting into it, and then we look up and we're surrounded by a circle of people who are smiling and clapping and cheering us on. And that was my first experience of coolness from people that I had been conditioned by my own upbringing to kind of fear and be wary of. So a few years later, I was working on my book, The Language of the Blues, and I got to interview wonderful blues legends like Robert Jr. Lockwood and Henry Gray, Little Milton Campbell, and Howlin' Wolf's closest friend and longtime guitarist Hubert Sumlin. In 1960, Willie Dixon wrote Spoonful for Howlin' Wolf, which was a hit for Wolf and a huge rock hit for Cream. And I'd always heard that song was about drugs, but Hubert Sumlin set me straight. He said, no, what would happen was Dixon and Wolf would get together, and Wolf would talk to Dixon and give him ideas for songs. So one day they were talking about how when Wolf was growing up, people would come over and borrow a spoonful of this and a teaspoon of that. And Wolf was taught that no matter how little you have, you don't just give a half inch, you give the whole inch, you give everything that you've got. And as Hubert said, Wolf put love in there too. It could be a spoonful of coffee, it could be a spoonful of tea, or just a little spoon of your precious love is good enough for me. That spoon, that spoon, that spoonful. So as I dug more into this concept of coolness, I discovered that it informs Yoruba morality, but it also informs art and music. And in Flash of the Spirit, an elder tells art historian Robert Thompson, beauty is a part of coolness, but beauty doesn't have the force of character that you need for really powerful art. And the elder said, this is Ashe, divine nature. And ethnomusicologist John Chernoff learned more about this when he was studying drumming in Ghana. And his teacher said, you know, that young, inexperienced drummers, they haven't yet learned to cool their heart and take their time. So their playing is yoli yoli, nothing, nothing. And the teacher added, if a student overplays to a really obnoxious degree, we just grab a stick so he doesn't play again. And that cracked me up because many flashy young blues players have heard the similar admonishment from their band leaders. Bob Margolin was a young white guy who joined the Muddy Waters band in Chicago. And Bob told me that when he would play something that Muddy found, you know, less than tasteful, Muddy would say, don't play it like that, it makes my dick sore. You know? And that's because blues artists are looking for that right note, you know, that spiritual connection. Texas blues guitar player Jimmy Vaughn explained it to me like this. He said, the blues contains these values. The space is as important as the notes, because without that space, you don't allow the listener time to feel what's been said. As slavers penetrated deeper into West Africa, they reached the Dahomey Kingdom, stronghold of the Vodun religion. Voda means great spirit or God, and is represented by the giant snake Dan carrying the universe in its coils. And today, in voodoo strongholds like Haiti and New Orleans, Dan is worshipped as the grand zombie, from the word Nzambi, which means God. And when voodoo practitioners gather to drum and dance, they're seeking to experience that holy, divine spirit. But Oluwa is only going to descend the center post of the temple to possess or ride a worshiper who's achieved a holy state of consciousness through this drumming and dancing. As the Haitian proverb states, great gods cannot ride little horses. And in the blues, you'll find a lot of this writing language, writers and writing, and this is where it stems from. African drums can also be used to talk because African languages are tonal, so you can kind of mimic speech. And this was discovered in South Carolina in 1739 after a deadly slave rebellion. And the slaves had organized this rebellion by communicating with each other with drums. After this, the black codes were passed, laws in different colonies that were severely repressive. Slaves caught drumming, speaking their languages, practicing their religions, even praying, were often summarily executed on the spot. In the face of this extremely harsh repression, slaves turned to another aspect of coolness, silence. In Yoruba culture, a cool person is silent unless he's got something important to say. His mouth is cool. Enu etutu is how they would say he fell silent. And slaves and their descendants used this form of coolness, silence, both to avoid trouble with white people and also to subtly resist them. And as Amiri Baraka wrote in his great book, Blues People, in 1963, in the ghetto, coolness took on an edge. To be cool was to remain calm, even unimpressed with what horror the world might daily propose. So this very stoic aspect of coolness has long been tested in West Africa in raucous verbal duels that are the origins of our rap culture. Opponents use obscenity and slander their mothers, each other's mothers, because they're trying to get the other guy to lose his cool. And in the United States, this survived as a game called The Dozens. And in 1930, Memphis Minnie recorded her song, New Dirty Dozen, which is just a song loaded with insults, basically. Come on, you folks, and start to walk. I'm fixing to start my dozens talk. What you thinking about ain't on my mind. That stuff you got is the sorriest kind. Well, you're a sorry mistreater, a robber and a cheater. Place you in the dozens, your papa and your cousin. Your mama was a lordy lord. So another important concept that survived the severe repression of slavery was this idea of divine repression. And it surfaced in black sanctified churches in the 1800s, where parishioners would do kind of a shuffle dance following the deacon around the table. The deacon was holding a standard, which was like a vestige of the temple's center pole. And parishioners would cry, "Drop down chariot and let me ride, and ride on King Jesus." And this was called rockin' the church. From like 1916 to 1970, some 7 million African American people left the South. And they carried these musical techniques and spiritual ideas about art out to the rest of the country. So guys like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, who had been Delta folk singers, started electric blues bands in Chicago. And they would have to shout to be heard over these blues bands, so they relied on gospel singing technique and developed this new shouting blues that radio beamed all over Black America. You had performers like Little Richard and Screaming Jay Hawkins who performed as if possessed. Elvis Presley started shaking and shouting, and even white teens started rocking. As Africans became Americans, they had encoded in the blues not only their pain and suffering, but also these profound ideas and musical techniques and concepts about consciousness that informed the way that we listen to music today and the way that we appreciate it. And this stuff was so potent that it birthed rock and roll and jazz within decades of its own conception. Because, sometimes from our own pain, we create a fortress of music so impenetrable that other people just walk away and leave us alone. But sometimes we create a sound so universally compelling that people outside our own are struck in their hearts. Suddenly they see us, they feel us, and we're not any different than they are, and they realize that maybe for the first time. The culture and the ethics that West African captives carried with them survived the shock of their transplantation to an entirely new world and invigorated a young nation. Although ill fate brought so many West African people here in chains, we're blessed that they arrived because it's their influence that makes us uniquely American and uniquely cool. Thank you.